make your pincushion, you'll need the following items: some fabric, pins, tailor's chalk, different scissors, a piece of paper, a pencil and a ruler. You will also need a sewing machine to complete this task and a hand needle and thread to close the gap at the end of the project. You start your pincushion by making a paper template, or in sewing terms we call it a paper pattern. Your template for your pincushion needs to be 15 by 15 centimetres squared. To do this, I'm putting the 15 line of my ruler on the edge of my piece of paper. I'm then putting a mark at the 0 line. I do that on two sides, then I use my ruler to line up the two marks and draw a line across, and then repeat on the other side. Where the lines interconnect is where the square will be, and this will ensure your square is 15 by 15 centimetres. Next, I take some paper scissors or craft scissors and I cut my square, and I want to make sure that I'm doing this evenly, so when I use it to cut out my fabric later, my fabric will also be 15 by 15 centimetres square. I'm then taking my pencil to mark on my piece of paper how big the measurements are, so I can keep this square and use it again in later projects. Next, I'm going to prepare my fabric. So I'm going to open it out and use an iron to remove any creases. Always ask permission to use the iron before you go ahead and use it, especially if you've never used an iron before. They can be quite hot and dangerous. I'm going over all those creases with my iron until I have removed them all. I've chosen to use the same piece of fabric for both sides of my pincushion, so when I fold it in half I can cut out two squares at the same time. You can see I am pinning those squares to my fabric, and then I'm using fabric scissors to cut out the two pieces of fabric evenly around the paper template that I made earlier. Take the pins out and set your fabric aside. Next, I'm going to take my two pieces of fabric and place one on top of the other, right sides together, or good sides together. We always sew inside out, so we must make sure that the good sides are facing in, so when we've finished our project, the good sides will be facing out. I am pinning my two pieces of fabric together and getting tailor's chalk to mark the lines where I'm going to sew. Your sewing should be about 1 to 1.5 centimetres in from the edge. This is called the seam allowance, the distance from the edge of the fabric from where we sew. Use tailor's chalk or a pencil to mark all the way around your fabric for your pincushion. On the last side, you need to leave a gap, and this is so you can turn your pincushion around the right way later and then put stuffing inside. So now it's time to start to sew your pincushion. We are going to start with one of the long edges. We're going to place the fabric underneath the presser foot and place the presser foot down, lining up the needle with the tailor's chalk that you drew on earlier. Going to go forwards and backwards a couple of stitches using the reverse button on the sewing machine. Sew all the way to the very end of your seam, and then you're going to hit that reverse button again. That reverse button will lock your stitches in place so they don't undo later. Your sewing should look something like that. You will then sew your next seam of your pincushion, again placing the fabric under the presser foot, putting your presser foot down, doing the reverse stitch at the start of the seam, sewing all the way to the end of that seam, and then doing that reverse stitch again, just 2 or 3 stitches to lock your sewing in place. Turn your pincushion around again and do the third seam, putting that presser foot down and sewing along the line of your tailor's chalk, doing a little reverse stitch at the start of your seam, sewing all the way to the very end of your seam, and again doing the reverse stitch to lock those stitches in place. Lastly, we are going to sew the seam that has the gap in it. Now to do this, you're going to do the reverse at the start and the end of each separate stitch. So reversing at the start, sewing to where the gap will start, and reverse stitching again. Moving your fabric out, cutting your threads, and then leaving that gap and repeating the process. Reverse stitch, sew to the end of the seam and reverse stitch again. So you can see here that there is a gap in your last final seam for flipping and stuffing your pincushion. You now want to take some time to remove any pins and also to snip the threads off your pincushion. You don't want these threads hanging around because they can cause problems for you later, and they also are just a really messy look on the inside of your work. Next, you want to trim the corners just a little bit, just to take away some excess fabric from the inside of your pincushion. Make sure you do not cut your stitches while you're trimming those corners. Once you've done that, you can flip your pincushion around the right way, and taking care to make sure that the corners are poking out. You can use a finger or an end of a pencil to get those corners sitting out so it's nice and square. Next up, we're going to stuff our pincushion. You want to use enough stuffing inside so you have a nice firm square shape. As you place the stuffing inside of the pincushion, make sure that you are pushing it into the corners of the shape so that it fills it up nicely. The last thing we need to do is hand sew that gap shut. To do this, we're going to use a stitch called the ladder stitch. First of all, you need to take off about 1 metre of thread and snip the end with some thread scissors, and then thread the eye of the needle. Once you've threaded the needle, bring the thread through so it's double stranded again, and tie a triple knot in the end of the thread. To tie the knot, you're going to wrap the thread around your finger and then push the end through. You'll need to do this 3 times in exactly the same spot to form that triple knot. The knot is used to stop the end of the thread going straight through the fabric, so it sort of holds it in place. To close the gap, we're going to use a stitch called the ladder stitch. It can also be known as the blind stitch or the invisible stitch. To create this stitch, you essentially go from one side of the gap to the other and going underneath the fold on each side of the fabric. So you can see here, going from the 1 across the 2, then underneath the fold to the 3, then over the top to the 4, underneath the fold to the 5, and so on. What you want to do is pick up your needle and bring the needle through from underneath the fold on one end and bring it through to the outside of your fabric. Make sure when you pull the thread that the knot is securely underneath the fold of the fabric. Just like in the previous image, what we're going to do is go across the gap and underneath the fold of the fabric on the other side. Then we go back across the gap and underneath the fold again of the other side. Then we go straight back across the gap and underneath the fold of the other side. I like to use an analogy of walking across the road when I'm doing a ladder stitch. So that is to walk across the road and then underneath the pavement, with the fold of the fabric being the pavement. Bring the needle through, then walk across the road again, straight across to the other side, and then underneath the pavement. Now you can see on this stitch that the thread is beginning to look like the rungs of a ladder, but when you gently pull on the thread, it will close the gap and the stitches will disappear, and this is why it's also called the invisible stitch or the blind stitch. You continue to go across the road and underneath the pavement until you get to the other end of your gap. Made it across to the other side and your gap is shut, You need to tie off your thread. Now you do this by doing 3 tiny little stitches, one exactly on top of the other. Lastly, you wrap the thread around the needle and pull it through in itself, and that will tie a secure knot. You can then push the needle through the gap and bring it out into the middle of the pincushion. Pull on the thread so it's tight and chop that off, and then the ends of the thread will be inside your pincushion. So there you go, you have now created a pincushion. You can pop some pins in that and start putting it to work with your next sewing project. Well done!